Okay, we are about to get started with our next session. So welcome everyone to the next presentation, the University of Maryland Disability Summit, Essential Yet Disposable, Food, Flowers, and Filth in the Pandemic Era. We have the pleasure of having Dr. Becca Monteleone, who is going to be with us. I will be the moderator for this session. My name is Jeremy. My pronouns are he, him, his. I'm a white man with a beard and glasses, with a white shirt with some florals and different colors on it, sitting in a greenish chair with a white wall behind me, a window with some light coming through, and a picture with a brown trimming, with I feel like hair that gets wilder as the day goes on, but that's I think how most days go. So welcome again to the UMD Disability Summit. We want to encourage folks while you're here today, please tweet and share about your experience, spread the word using the hashtags #DisabilitiesUMD, #2021 Disability Summit. And also if you can utilize, and also to do the @ for @UMD Disability S1. So I'm now moving to our next slide. So this is a note to everyone that this session is going to be recorded. Pursuant to Maryland law, we are required to provide verbal or visual notification of recording. If you continue to participate after being notified that the activity is being recorded, your consent to recording is implied. So please keep that in mind. If you are staying on for the session, this means that you are consenting to being recorded, and we just appreciate you being here. Finally, in terms of accessibility services for this session, American Sign Language interpreters video will be displayed during the entire session, so attendees can pin the videos or remove interpreters from the screen. For a better view and experience, we really recommend that you use a desktop device versus the mobile app. And also, cart service can be enabled by selecting the closed captioning feature located on the bottom bar within the Zoom webinar to enable basically to enable the live caption within Zoom, or of course on your own device. With that said, folks are allowed to, of course, ask questions during this presentation. So please post any questions in the chat during Becca's presentation. We're going to select a sample of those questions, and then we're going to ask Becca to answer them at the end of the presentation. So with that said, it's my pleasure to introduce again Dr. Becca Monteleone. I'm going to ask you, Becca, when you bring up your slides, but before you start, to describe, as I did, just sort of, who you are, and if you have slides as you go through them, just to give our audience some description as we continue. So with that said, we are going to get started.
Great, thank you so much, Jeremy. So I do have slides, which I'm about to share here. Let me just make sure I can see everything all right. So hello, everyone. I'm Rebecca Monteleone. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm an assistant professor of disability studies at the University of Toledo. I'm a white woman with short dark hair and transparent peach glasses. I am wearing my favorite dress today, which is a black dress with polka dots on it. And thank you all for being here today. Today, I want to talk to you about work. Particularly the work that is done by people with intellectual disabilities during the pandemic era. This presentation is very much a work in progress right now. It's emerging from this larger project I'm doing about disabled experiences of the pandemic. So I'm really especially looking forward to the Q&A today, where maybe we can generate some new connections and ideas together. The slide here has my title, Essential Yet Disposable, Food, Flowers, and Filth in the Pandemic Era. It also has my name and my affiliation and my Twitter handle, which is @Becca Monteleone, so no R in the Rebecca. And it also has my website. So access copies I know are available on the conference itinerary, but they're also available on my website, which is just my first and last name.com. The speech text also will have the citations that I used for today's presentation. I also just want to give a very quick content warning. So obviously I'll be talking about the pandemic today during the presentation. And then briefly at the end of the talk, I will be very briefly discussing gun violence. So just be aware that that will be part of today's presentation. So the limited employment options available to people with intellectual and developmental disabilities in the United States have come to be known derisively as the 3 Fs: food, flowers, and filth. Those 3 Fs are restated on the slide here. Food, of course, refers to any type of food service, from cafeteria busser to grocery store clerk. Flowers is a reference to landscaping work, and filth to janitorial or maintenance work. Occasionally, an additional 2 Fs are tacked on to the end, standing for filing, such as in office administration, and factories, for the piecemeal work that often characterizes segregated workplaces. These 3 or 5 Fs are generally understood to be socially undesirable, low wage, and low skill positions, reflecting the categorically low expectations that are placed on people with intellectual disabilities. Even when communities move away from the segregation and exploitation of sheltered workshops, options beyond these kinds of positions are slim. The statistics bear this out. In a 2011 study from the Department of Education, it was found that young adults with intellectual disabilities, of those that were currently working, 70% were working in positions that fall within these categories. Another 10% were working in manual labor positions in moving or transportation. However, when many of these traditionally devalued roles have suddenly become recast as indispensable in the pandemic era. With the abrupt reclassification from undervalued to essential, workers with intellectual disabilities are suddenly confronted with an unprecedented recognition of their labor, entangled with an increased demand for risk to their health and well-being. In a recent series of interviews, I spoke with 12 adults with intellectual disabilities about their pandemic experiences. Of those, just half were in employment outside of day programs and sheltered workshops, all in positions that fall within these 3 Fs. One left her position at a restaurant at the beginning of the pandemic for fear of getting ill. 2 were in janitorial positions and lost their jobs in the first wave of unemployment to hit the United States last spring. This is an experience that is mirrored by many across the country. A recent report from the Center for an Urban Future in New York City, for example, revealed that employment service providers and advocacy organizations report a, quote, near total job losses and unending furloughs for people being served in these programs. Of those I interviewed that continued to work during the pandemic, 2 were working in grocery stores and 1 in food service at an assisted living facility. The reclassification to essential work brought with it a level of appreciation that those I spoke to had not previously experienced. The slide here features a quote from Melissa, a pseudonym. She said of her position at a grocery store, quote, 2 other coworkers are not working right now at this time because of the virus. And I wish that I was one of those 2. And then when I was hearing, that they're congratulating all the essential workers in that, and then I was like, okay, it's not so bad after all. Okay, well, now we're getting recognized. And I wasn't sure if the world was going to recognize us because, I've been doing okay and we're just grocery people. We're just the ones that help keep you fed. And then there's doctors and nurses, but they're getting more credit. But now I'm quite okay. And I like the title of being an essential worker or hero. Like I said, I wasn't at first, but then I'm like, well, okay, end quote. John, who also worked in a grocery store, mentioned that work was crucial to breaking through the isolation he was experiencing otherwise, saying that outside of videos and phone calls, quote, that's the only time to talk to people. This quote is also stated on the slide. These feelings of isolation, exclusion, and loneliness have commonly been reported by people with intellectual disabilities, even in pre-COVID times, and seem to have only been exacerbated under pandemic protocols. Though beyond the scope of this presentation, I've written elsewhere about how the professionalization of relationships encountered by many with intellectual disabilities, such as paid caregiving, adult day services, and residential programs, has produced a power differential in social relationships that seems to have been exacerbated during the COVID pandemic. Relationships with coworkers, like John referenced, may represent a break from that pattern. However, the strain of working during the pandemic era was felt acutely, and the risks that disproportionately impact marginalized body minds in service positions reveals a counter-narrative to the celebration of essential work. Difficult changes to routines, the burden of new health and safety protocols, and feelings of uncertainty arising from a lack of information about how to adequately protect oneself while working were shared in these interviews. Amanda, who worked in an assisted living facility, wished her employer provided information about how to protect herself in ways that were easier for her to understand, saying, quote, "Technically, that's harder for someone like me. But if somebody shows me what to do and all that kind of thing, I would do it. But I just need to be shown what to do," end quote. Her quote is also stated on the slide. Melissa talked explicitly about her fears of COVID-19 and her resentment toward customers who wouldn't follow safety guidelines. She and Amanda both lamented new routines that involve showering and disinfecting after work. Amanda became visibly upset when talking about how her family was now afraid to come near her after work for fear of infection. Those working in these positions are ostensibly celebrated, while their safety and lives are simultaneously undermined through a lack of information, protection, and consideration from the public. Taken together with public discourses about acceptable deaths among those with pre-existing conditions, medical triage and care rationing plans that deprioritize disabled people, the application of non-consensual do not resuscitate orders on people with intellectual disabilities in the United Kingdom, the failure to provide personal protective equipment to home healthcare workers, many of whom are women of color, and other related practices, the execution of, quote, essential yet inherently risky work by people with intellectual disabilities can be understood not as an acknowledgement of the social value of diverse body minds, but as an affirmation of the perceived disposability of those already marginalized. There's one other story that I want to share, and it was not one that I originally intended on putting into this discussion. And in some ways, I struggle to place it in the context of my argument, but it felt important to voice and acknowledge. On Monday, March 24th, 10 people were killed in a mass shooting at a King Soopers grocery store in Boulder, Colorado. One of those killed that day was 51-year-old Terry Leiker. On the slide is a photograph showing Terry, a white woman with short, light brown hair and a purple floral shirt. She'd worked at the grocery store for 30 years, and she was a person with an intellectual disability. I don't know exactly how Terry's story fits into this conversation on essential work, the 3 F's, and disposability, but her life and her death felt important to recognize here in this space as part of that conversation. The relationship between essential work, disposability, and intellectual disability requires a deeper consideration, particularly for people who are multiply marginalized along axes of ability, race, gender, class, and citizenship status. In a recent community conversation hosted by the Transgender Law Center, disabled writer and activist Eli Clare spoke about the double risk encountered by disabled, trans, and otherwise marginalized body minds in the pandemic era: the viral risk and the, quote, systemic institutional risk. While the pandemic has brought new challenges, Clare argues that it, quote, feels like a very old moment. And that's, I think, where I want to start our conversation today. How can our understanding of the pandemic, of risk, of essential work, and of the value of lives be refracted through our imperfect histories rather than explored as if in isolation? Because while the pandemic is new, ableism is getting very, very old. And I think that's where I want to open up our Q&A and see how we can continue this conversation. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for this wonderful and this presentation, Becca. We're going to look and see if we have questions. So I feel like we've been given an invitation for dialogue, so I really appreciate that. And so we're encouraging folks listening to this presentation, if you have questions, please put them in the chat so that we are able to and we have our lovely presenter here just to share more about the presentation and just, any questions and answer any questions y'all may have. So I see the first question that we have here have you been working your Ohio APSC chapter about the issues that you've talked about?
Thank you for this question. So for those not familiar, APSC is an advocacy organization around work. So I am relatively new to Ohio. I just started this position at the University of Toledo at the beginning of the academic year. And so I've not been connected with Ohio's APSC chapter, but I have worked as a contracted researcher with several other employment organizations, employment first chapters in a couple of different states. And then also I've worked with a few other kind of employment advocacy places, but I haven't talked specifically about these issues around essential work and these 3 Fs, right? So the 3 Fs are something that anybody who works in this space around employment is familiar with, the ways in which people with intellectual disabilities are relegated to these socially undervalued positions. But connecting it to this idea of essential work and risk, this, as I mentioned, is a really new piece of work for me. And so I am hoping to extend it and make these connections, but haven't yet. So thank you for that question.
Yeah. Okay, so right now it looks like we're just waiting to see if other folks have any questions that are coming up. So I guess in the meantime, perhaps I can ask a question just as we're waiting to see. Yeah, I'm just sort of curious, you know, the framework that you brought, the framework that you sort of introduced around, which I love, is like food, flowers, filth, like, and you were sharing before too, and the additional F sometimes as well. Is this a framework that others are sort of utilizing, or just kind of like, if you could share more maybe about the history of this framework? Because I think, you know, in some cases, a lot of these frameworks we're seeing, in some ways, especially as a person who, as an able-bodied person, being seen as like new in the pandemic, but of course, many of these frameworks have a deep history that are getting more light or more attention because of the pandemic. So just curious if there's anything you want to share about this framework and how it's been used in current and pre-pandemic settings.
Sure. I mean, so this is a framework that has existed in this space for a really long time. It is not one that I've seen encounter a lot of kind of critical analysis. It's one that I've seen mostly appear in practice, right? And so people who are working in these employment settings, right? So people who are doing VR work and so forth, I will see use this framework. I did try to trace back the origins of the 3 Fs, and the oldest reference that I can find is that it gets mentioned in Joseph Shapiro's book, No Pity, from the early 90s. But he is referencing it as if it has existed prior to that. And so I wonder if it just exists in those kind of places that are outside of the archives, because it's not, like I said, a framework that I've seen get a lot of kind of critical analysis. You know, particularly I come from a disability studies background. Disability studies has done historically a pretty poor job at doing any kind of analysis around intellectual disability, but it's something that I think requires a lot more attention.
Yeah. Yeah, and just thank you for bringing this. I mean, I feel like welcoming this into this critical framework as you're doing. The next question we have here, now as essential workers, did you find that people were given additional pay, like in terms of the current setting, thus kind of encouraging them to put themselves at greater risk?
This is a good question. So none of the folks that I interviewed received additional pay, though several of them were working longer hours or more hours than they previously had done. So I don't know on a grand scale how that has changed, but that's just the experience with the research that I was doing.
The next question we have here were people who were working in office spaces at all that you interviewed, were any of them sort of transition to telework, or what sort of was the situation that, what did work life become for the folks that you interacted with?
So no one who I was working with was in an office position. So everyone who I interviewed was in service positions. But it's an interesting question. It's an interesting question, and I'm curious about what that experience has been like for people with intellectual disabilities. And maybe this relates to the first presentation in the session today, right? Around the accessibility of computers and the accessibility of the internet and navigating telework, or whether people were just kind of, a lot of people lost their jobs, right? That's the reality. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, I feel like there's so many questions to be asked in this, for this particular conversation. And actually now in terms of questions, we're starting to get a few more in. So one of the next questions that we have here was, I'm curious about legal frameworks that disabled essential workers may have engaged or not. Did you find people utilizing ADA, or were the barriers there too high? parenthetical with documentation, et cetera. And I'm thinking about the intersectional framework that you've also put forward in thinking about this analysis and this question.
Yeah, so I think that's a really good question. And no one who I interviewed utilized the ADA or anything like that. A lot of people were furloughed or chose to take leaves of absence, though it was unclear in some cases whether those leaves of absence were permanent or not. It seemed like some people did not know whether they would be invited back to their positions or not, but I didn't see any utilization of anti-discrimination laws like the ADA.
Okay. And I'm just because you only have 5 minutes left, I'm going to keep moving through the questions. I appreciate you answering so many of them. So the next one we have here is, how did you find this framework or research ties into the conversation on larger union and workers' rights movements? And if it doesn't, any thoughts on how you would like for it to?
Yeah, again, a really excellent question. So this is one of these spaces that I'd like to extend this work. So this finding about essential work, this kind of emergent idea about this interrogation of essential work and intellectual disability, the project that I was doing wasn't focused on that initially. This was just something that came out of these initial sets of interviews. And so it's something I would like to further develop and pursue, and tying in things like unions and labor movements and so forth, and the recognition of class differences and race differences and gender differences in these experiences is absolutely, I think, the direction that this work needs to move in.
Yeah. Okay, and this question actually feels quite close to home for me, and thanks to what you just shared. Did you interview any seniors or older adults who continue to work out of necessity? And what are your thoughts about older individuals and their roles in the service industry, especially during this pandemic? So have you interviewed any folks still working, and your thoughts about their role during this pandemic and what's going on in that context?
So again, this was a really interesting question. So I didn't interview anyone who identified themselves as a senior, but I did interview folks who were worried about money, right? So who were working because they were worried about money coming into their homes, right? And I think, again, this is a space that requires a lot more careful thought. What are my thoughts about older individuals and their roles in the service industry? I mean, I think it's probably following a very similar framework, right? So this idea of being celebrated for filling these quote essential roles, while at the same time being asked to take on risk in order to live, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it makes me think a lot about the use of the narrative of the hero during this time.
Yeah.
Okay, moving on with questions. Do you perceive any stigma or issues in the future once mask mandates are reduced or eliminated, when people with disabilities might continue to use PPE in these roles?
Ooh, this is a really excellent question too. Thank you all for really engaging with this. You've given me a lot to think about. So rather than answer your question, maybe I'll sidestep it slightly, because one of the things that did become really clear in doing these interviews is that a lot of people who have left positions don't want to return to them just because the mask mandates end or just because things open back up, right? So there are some other kind of barriers to re-entry into work that people are identifying for themselves. And so rather than answer this question about mask mandates and PPE, I think that we will see a slower return to the workforce for disabled people for obvious reasons, right? And I wonder about, because of the sort of massive unemployment crisis that's happening in the United States right now, if those positions will still be there when disabled people feel like they aren't risking their lives to re-enter the workforce.
Yeah, an excellent question. Thank you for that thoughtful response. Let's see, I think since we're coming up to maybe about 2 minutes left, I'm not seeing too many more questions. So, oh wait, actually, I think there's one more. For those that you interviewed, did they indicate that they received any extensive training on COVID and safety measures to protect themselves, especially from outside clinical educators versus an HR person, for example?
No, I mean, no. So there was a lot of expression of not knowing what to do, and the rules keep changing and things. So I completed these interviews last summer. And so at that time, there was a lot of kind of shifting information for a lot of people in the United States, but the kind of constant changing of what the protocols were, the information, and often these these guidelines, like I mentioned with that quote from Amanda, were given in a way that was just very difficult to understand for some people. There's really no acknowledgement of cognitive accessibility in the ways in which these kinds of guidelines can be presented, which just created increasing anxiety and increasing kind of feelings of risk.
Yeah, and along the language lines, it makes me think of also like the language in which things are being presented, tying into all these different things. So we are at the end of of our time for this session. Again, folks, all sessions are recorded, and the summit planning committee will basically let folks know when things are distributed, when the recordings and everything are ready. We want to thank you so much, Dr. Monteleone, for being with us. And yeah, if you have any quick final thoughts or final reflections you want to share before we close out in the next like 20, 30 seconds.
Just another thank you. And to say, like I said, this is very much a piece of work very early in progress. And so I really appreciate all your feedback. I'll drop my email into the chat if anybody wants to continue the conversation.
Great. Thank you all so much for being part of this, and thank you so much for your presentation.